Hi, my name is Francesca Dominici, and I'm a professor of biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. School of Public Health. And I am here with two of my colleagues, both professor in biostatistics, Brent Coull and Jim Ware. And Brent and I are really delighted that we will spend some time having a conversation with Jim about the 6 city studies. Both Brent and I work on, I would say, the general topic of environmental biostatistics and the analysis of health effects of air pollution. And throughout our career, we always been viewed the 6 city studies as one of the landmark study of which Jim was the main statistician. So I'm going to turn it to Brent to start and ask a few questions and talk to Jim about it.
Great. Thank you, Francesca. So Jim, I'd like to first thank you for taking the time today to tell us a little bit about your early days here at the school and kind of talk to us a little bit about how environmental statistics, really started out here at the school and how 6 cities played a big role in that. And I thought before we got started, we could talk a little bit about, your time I know you spent some time at the NIH before you came here at the school, and hear a little bit about that work and how that kind of led up to the work you started doing here.
So as I was thinking about that question, I was thinking it might be useful to start with my experience at Stanford briefly. So Stanford, of course, is an outstanding department and was very classical in a way and theoretical at the time I was there. And I had the good fortune to be a student of Brad Efron. And so I actually, my thesis was about modeling the trajectories of missiles, to believe it or not, but it's longitudinal data, but with information, temporal information. So it was related to actually my later interests, although the connection isn't too strong. But then I went to NIH, and I was really very inexperienced in practical biostatistics when I went to NIH. I remember the first time my department head, Max Halpern, was shocked I didn't know how to use Fisher's exact test, So, but I really got an immersion in practical problems, of course, at NIH because we, in addition to working on the multi-center clinical trials that NIH sponsored, we also worked with the investigators at the clinical center, and I had some very nice collaborations with cardiologists that were working at the clinical center. But next door to us was the epidemiology department, which was the home to the Framingham Heart Study, and Manning Feinlieb, who later became head of NCHS, was the head of epidemiology there. And he and I would occasionally have conversations, and he would say, well, why can't we take the trajectories of blood pressure in children and predict whether they're going to be hypertensive at adults? Right. And questions like that, kind of lifespan questions, which of course today have become a major theme in biomedical research. So I tried to work on that problem, and I did publish a couple of papers also with Margaret Wu, my colleague there, and but they were primitive looking back. I was still trapped in the old-fashioned way of doing multivariate statistics, that you would have complete data and you would fit a multivariate model, and it was just so inadequate for the realities of modern biostatistics and the way we actually collect data and the gaps and the irregularities and all of that. So I was kind of stumped. I had these solutions, but they were so inadequate. I would, for example, take complete data sets and predict the adult value from the child's values and so on. So then in 1978, I applied for a position here at Harvard, and as I was preparing to come, I learned that Yvonne Bishop, who had been involved in the 6 city study, had decided to leave Harvard and to go to the Energy Administration. So when I came up here, I had an opportunity to interview for a position with the 6 city study. And I met with Frank Spicer. And so Frank has these famous curves associated with Frank and others about the trajectory of pulmonary function through life, how our pulmonary function grows until it plateaus in the early 20s, and then it declines. And it declines as a function of our behavior, of smoking and other characteristics. And childhood effects can determine what our plateaus are also. So he said, gee, we'd really like to understand this trajectories throughout life and how air pollutants, both indoor and outdoor, smoking and others, affect these trajectories. I went, wow, that's amazing. So I said, yes, I'd love to do that. And so I came up and joined. And one of the really helpful things about the Six Cities study was that in a soft money environment, I had 40% support continuously for, gosh, it turned out to be 15 years at least.
Wow.
I mean, we were at that for a long time. And so I immediately went to work, and thanks to Yvonne's hard work, there'd already been 5 years of data collection, and so we already were in a position to begin to do research. Mm-hmm. So we immediately went to work, and I encountered this problem about how to really do something with the longitudinal data.
So it really overlapped a lot with what you had
Yes,
been
it
working on
had been a
NIH.
thread. When I was in NIH, I was also interested in survival analysis and
I
did a
see.
little work in that area. But I'd always had this interest in repeated measures and how to understand the lifespan and so on. And so this was a really incredible opportunity.
Interesting.
And the other thing, of course, is that I had this fantastic set of collaborators that within the Six Cities study itself, there were pulmonary physicians, engineers, physicists, chemists, technology people that could build equipment. It was really fabulous. Epidemiologists. So, it was an opportunity to learn a lot from my colleagues.
So I have, I'm very curious about something. So, you have pioneered a lot of the development of new statistical methods for analysis of longitudinal data, and co-authored a book about it, and all of the wonderful theory behind an application with mixed effect models. And I think many of us in this profession are always thinking, to what degree there was new methodological the development when the case study, in this case the Six Cities study, motivated the methodological development.
Yeah.
And in the paper, in the New England Journal of Medicine paper, it's a pretty simple survival analysis, although extremely powerful. So I was just wondering if you could talk about how did you merge the idea and the passion of developing new methodology for analysis of longitudinal data together with, a very visible study. And so how do you combine these two? Were the type of data that motivated you to develop new methods you were developing, how that interaction worked?
Well, I think that really speaks to my collaboration with Nan Laird, that compared to Nan, I'm a more applied person, and I'm interested in solving biomedical problems. And so I was really keen to answer the questions the Six Cities study was a phenomenal study. They studied 8,000 children from 1st through 12th grade, and they studied 8,000 adults at triennial examinations for 12 years. So we had 12 years of data on adults and 12 years of data on children from, adolescence, for early adolescence or pre-adolescence up to high school graduation. So it was a phenomenal data set. It wasn't all in hand at the time we began, but it was well along. So I had a real passion to solve that problem, and Nan, coincidentally, had studied exactly the kind of things that we needed to know. Her dissertation was about empirical Bayes models for contingency tables. And of course, she wrote that famous paper with Art Dempster on the EM algorithm. So Nan had these technologies, these statistical tools that turned out to fit this problem perfectly.
Right.
So she was able to say, look, we can really deal with these indirect data, these incomplete data, and this method, the EM algorithm, can work here. And so really I took enormous advantage of Nan's expertise and her methodologic background, and it just turned out to be a perfect fit. So I think the moral of the study there was really a collaboration between, let's say, a more applied statistician and a person with more of a theoretical background in terms of her earlier work. Nan had done, I think, more important work methodologically, and it turned out to be the work we needed. So it was very fortuitous. And of course, I always think that it was the development of modern computing was central to all of this, because none of this would have been possible, 10 years before we did that work. And when you look at the famous Liang and Ziegler paper on the generalized linear model, that was then the next big step forward in creating a family of methods for repeated measures, both with linear models and nonlinear models. And so I give a lot of credit to Nan for what we were able to accomplish.
Following up on your idea, one of the things that's just so beautiful about those two papers that you and Nan wrote, the two biometrics papers, right, that considered linear mixed models and logistic mixed models, is just there's such a general framework, that can handle all types of different, growth trajectory type situations. And so I wondered whether that was really the framework that you needed for the 6-city study, or you guys really had the foresight to kind of lay out a very general framework that would just cover lots and lots of different situations. And if you had kind of weighed those different types of ways to frame the problem.
Well, the linear mixed models were a huge asset for us because we had pulmonary function measures. And we were able to, sometimes we generalize the model, for example, use a spline function and things like that, but still within the framework of linear mixed models, we were able to analyze these repeated pulmonary function measures and made a lot of observations. We were able to characterize the normal decline of pulmonary function and how it's influenced by smoking, made some really, I think, important observations there, characterized the effects of indoor air, exposure to side stream cigarette smoke, for example, on pulmonary function in children and adults. So the linear mixed models really was extremely valuable. The nonlinear mixed models, I think, I always looked more to the Liang and Ziegler paper as the more comprehensive solution to the nonlinear case, and so we tended to use that more often than the methodology we described in that paper by Stiratelli et al. So I think that paper was overtaken by other methodologic developments. That's the way I look at it.
I see.
So I'm wondering if you could, one thing I'm really curious is if you could share with us even some of the conversation and, how really did it happen. So, going back to the 6-city study, right? So you were recruited and you had the opportunity to be, to work on this data. How did it work? So there was like a regular meeting. You were present results with Frank Spicer. What were some of the Frank Spicer, comment and reaction were. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that? I just want to hear the behind the scene.
Sure. Well, so there were, in terms of epidemiology and biostatistics, Ben Ferris and Frank were always very interested. Tom Lewis was a very active and valuable and creative contributor to the work, and we all had space over on the 13th floor of Building 1, so it wasn't just emailing. We actually went over, and I spent 2 days a week over there, and there were analysts, and so we would spend the few hours meeting with the analysts, and then Frank would come by. Frank was always very conscientious about being an active participant in the study, even though he had all those responsibilities at the Channing lab. So there were a lot of meetings, and we were always, and Doug Dockery, of course, was very actively involved and led a lot of the analyses. And then we had some great postdoctoral fellows, Xiaobin Wang, who's now a professor, named professor at Hopkins, and did a lot of nice work. And her husband, Shiping Xu, also did a lot of nice work for us. So we had a number of quantitatively oriented people who helped us. And I think the world was moved at a little slower pace in those days. Now with our emails and our phones and everything, we're constantly having these fragmented interactions. But in those days, we would spend a half a day, and part of it would be working with the analytical team, and part of it would be sharing results, and then working on drafts of papers. So it was
the analytical team was all together, and all the data were, this is where, everybody had access to the same data, because data were being collected at the same time that you guys were analyzing it, right? So that would be routinely updated, and was the same team that extract the data from the interview, and so it was also the data management team. I think that's what I'm asking.
And you bring out an excellent point, that such a critical part of a study like that is
Right.
your data management team. We had an air quality data management team, and we had a epidemiologic, a human response team, and each team was responsible for the quality of their and currency of their data set. And we were fortunate we had two outstanding leaders of those two data management teams. So actually, at one point, a former employee accused the Six City study of having falsified data, and it was in the era where there was a lot of sensitivity to that, and also because of the controversies around the chest studies, that received a lot of attention. And always the environmental, the companies that are impacted, like the steel industry and so on, are quick to support those concerns. So we actually we actually went through an investigation, and they froze all our data, put it in rooms, and we had to. So this was an amazing experience. So the culmination of this investigation was that NIH appointed a committee, and the committee called us down to Bethesda to be interviewed. So we went down to Bethesda in building 3, I think it was, across from the clinical center, and met with these folks, and we had sent boxes and boxes of data to them. So they said, after a few minutes, maybe an hour of talking, they said, well, I see here in Topeka actually it was in Kingston, Tennessee, on such and such date, you said that the NO2 value was such and such. Let's verify that. And so Doug, this was like, I personally was not involved in any of this, so I was watching to see, oh my God, how's this going to turn out? So Doug said, okay, go down in the storage room where all these boxes are and pull out folders number X, Y, and Z. Wow. So they went down there and they got the folders. So now both of our data management people were with us. So they said, okay, show us how you got that value. So the young woman who was responsible for the air quality data management took out this strip chart that was from that day in Kingston or Harriman, Tennessee, whichever it was. We studied in those communities, probably one air pollution site for both communities. And then she got a ruler out, and she started doing this and this and this. And she says, well, I think the value should be 29.2. And my golly, that was exactly the value that was in the data set. And it looked to me like such a primitive way of doing it, but they said, okay,
it was the only
that
way.
was it. The investigation was over after that, because the allegation had been that the air quality people had manipulated the air quality data. So, but that was, I'll tell you, my heart was in my throat.
Was already clear to you guys that was going to be such an impactful study? Because, impact goes together with scrutiny.
Yeah, the Six City study, in one way, from a statistical point of view, is an extremely simple study. Mm-hmm. It's an N of 6, and yet it filled an enormous gap in air quality research. There was no scientific basis for setting air quality standards for fine particles and sulfur dioxide and NO2. And so there was the APA was really in a difficult position. So the Six City study became the linchpin of air quality standards for a significant period of time. So even though it was significantly limited in certain ways, it had an enormous impact. And we knew that right away, because I hadn't been at Harvard long before I was going down to Washington and being challenged by industry representatives and getting right in the middle of the controversy.
It's interesting. You hear these same themes still exist today with reproducibility, right? We collect more and more mountains of data, but the same kind of fundamental ideas about can you reproduce your data. Yeah. We're seeing it in almost every study we do now here as well.
I know, and it seems that the standards and requirements keep escalating, and I sometimes wonder if the burden on science is going to be counterproductive, that it becomes so difficult to meet all these requirements. You see it in the pharmaceutical industry, right, what they have to do to get a drug approved now. You could argue, well, we have to be sure the drugs are safe, but there is clearly a trade-off between moving drugs forward and being conservative about side effects and adverse events. So,
Right.
yeah, the world has changed a lot in that regard.
If I could follow up on one of Francesca's questions, she was asking about when you realized that there would be a big impact of the 6-city study, and I'm wondering, when did you and Nan realize that the linear mixed model would have such a huge impact on statistical practice for longitudinal data? I mean, if you think about it now, that it's really the de facto approach for analyzing, repeated measures of continuous outcomes, whether it's pulmonary function data or any other type of outcome.
I think of that paper as the seed in a way. I mean, that now the tree has bloomed and there's so many wonderful extensions, adaptations. So when you see people doing longitudinal analysis now, it's often usually more sophisticated than our initial simple mixed models, growth curve models that were the core of that initial paper. So I think of it, I see the field as really, evolved in a wonderful way. Now, in terms of when did we realize our paper would have an impact, I think we knew that it was a nice contribution because it received a lot of attention and we gave short courses and spoke at the meetings and so on. But and I do think it's certainly the most significant paper I've ever I was associated with in my career. And I think, it takes a few years for you to look back and say, gee, I'm proud of that paper,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I wondered if, once it started making it into commercial software where everyone could do it, ProcMix seemed like a huge, event. I think ProcMix started out in SAS in the early 90s maybe.
Yeah.
And that really seemed to really explode,
Yes.
the availability of the approaches.
Yeah, and we talked a lot to the people there were all kind of technical issues about how to do it, and we had some nice conversations. There were some very able people at SAS
Right.
who did that software development, and they really understood the theory quite well.
Right.
So that did have a big impact on practice. Yeah.
Right.
There is this figure that you guys have on the New England Journal of Medicine paper that I use often in the lectures and class. That there is this figure that is PM 2.5 average, plotted against mortality rate ratio for the 6 cities, and there are these 6 data points, right? They line up like perfectly. I never seen anything. So I'm curious, when you saw that plot the first time, and were you surprised?
Well, you mentioned that before. The driving investigators for those mortality studies were Arden Pope and Doug. Arden Pope was from Brigham Young, and he came out on postdoc several times. And he, visiting professor, and he really was the person who was most passionate about it. I always thought the survival analysis I wasn't as interested in that because it wasn't methodologically innovative. But you're right; that paper was very influential, and it was. I think we have to think that in terms of trying to influence policy, we were very lucky in that our data didn't raise a lot of questions about, well, is this real, and what do you make of this point, and so on. It could have been, just by chance.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, of course, there have been a number of studies and books written now about the burden of particulate air pollution on mortality. And even today, people argue that even at current levels, which are dramatically reduced, at the time we began this, that's another interesting fact. When we began the 6-city study, we were coming out of an era of intensive coal and oil-fired combustion, especially in the Middle West, where the steel plants and so on, and air quality standards were really, we had bad blackouts and smog alerts in Steubenville, Ohio, and St. Louis, and places like that. And over the course of the 6-city study, air quality improved quite a lot. But people still argue that there's still a burden of mortality with being in the more highly polluted parts of the U.S. So if that's true, imagine what's happening in China now.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
That's right.
I find it a little hard to believe it, even though the empirical, the statistical analysis supports it, but we know that statistical analysis can't always be trusted when you get especially into low-level exposures and so on. So I'm not an expert on those data about how they came up with those numbers, but I worry that because the air seems so much better today, you wonder, is there really a mortality burden? I don't know, but others are more expert than I.
Right. Well, and that's one of the enduring legacies of the Six City study, just how much the levels have come down in the U.S. over the last 20
that's right.
years.
It had a big impact on policy. And, industry has fought it every step of the way, and you understand.
And they continue to.
And I understand their position, but in some of those cases, you felt like it was like the tobacco industry. They were defending the indefensible, kind of.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, just probably maybe as a last question. I mean, clearly, there has been, a Jim Ware after the Six City study, and and you had this extremely productive career, in administration and in research. And so I was wondering, maybe you can speak a little bit about how all of this, I would say, from my viewpoint, and I think you will agree, wonderful opportunity in working on this multidisciplinary collaboration. How has it impacted, your career past the Six City studies and being, so different and having multiple roles in academia?
Well, I think that when I look back to the Six City study, it was really formative. And the lessons I would take away for junior investigators, young people coming into the field now, is pick your collaborators carefully, that the caliber, particularly for we as statisticians, when we work, the kind of work I do, which is partnering with people and with other disciplines, then the quality of those individuals and the importance of their work has an enormous impact on you. So
Right.
I was very fortunate in that I teamed up with a really outstanding group. In addition to Frank and Ben Ferris, there was Jack Spengler, who was a major figure in air pollution research and very innovative in terms of developing. I mean, Jack's to me, his most interesting contribution was when he decided to carry portable devices onto airplanes and measured the air quality in airplane cabins and demonstrated that the air quality was no better in the non-smoking section than in the smoking section. And when those data came out, Congress very rapidly passed the ban on smoking in airplanes. Talk about a huge contribution to public health. But he did a lot of innovative work in developing things that could be worn in backpacks and all that sort of stuff. He always had his students going around town with their backpacks on, measuring things, So, and then Petros Koutrakis, who was his student and then is now a professor at the school, also was very interested in developing technology for measuring and even concentrating air pollutants for different kinds of studies and so on. So they were very important parts of our team also.
And I know that legacy lives on now. I know they're still looking at health effects of flying and airplane exposures as well. So it's very interesting.
So I think you were asking what are the lessons from that, and I think one of my most important lessons is pick good colleagues, and of course your own career is so shaped by your own knowledge and skills, and part of that is mutable. If you work hard, you'll learn things,
right.
But part of it's a gift.
Yeah.
And that people have different gifts. And so getting in tune with what you can do well and then trying to build on that. And I wouldn't say that I wasn't particularly wise about that. I just followed my nose kind of, but I was lucky that I do feel it was a lot of good fortune that I wandered into wonderful opportunities one after another, And then of course, I've stayed involved in clinical trials research, and I've had this long partnership at the New England Journal now where I've been there for 26 years, and that's, as I got into administration, that was really rewarding to go over and talk about science every week. So.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Great.
Thank you, Jim.
All
This
right,
was
nice to
wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.